Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar of KUASIA webinar series for the spring 2022 semester. Today, we are very happy to host a distinguished guest, Ho-fung Hung, for a book talk. Ho-fung Hung got his BA and master's degrees in sociology from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And then he got his second master's degree in sociology again from Binghamton University in 1999. He then earned his PhD degree in sociology from the Johns Hopkins University in 2004. Hung worked at the Indiana University at Bloomington between 2005 and 2011. He joined the Johns Hopkins University in 2011, where he is currently a professor in the Department of Sociology and Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. In addition to writing numerous articles and book chapters, some of them award-winning, Hung published several books. His first book, titled Protest with Chinese Characteristics, Demonstrations, Riots, and Petitions in the Mid-Qing Dynasty, was published by Columbia University Press in 2011. I assigned this book in various classes of mine, and some of the coach students are already quite familiar with that book. The book won the Social Science History Association President's Book Award and the Best Book Prize of the Southeast Conference of the Association for Asian Studies. Hung's second book, titled The China Boom, Why China Will Not Rule the World, was published by the Columbia University Press in 2016. The China book received the Asian and Transnational Studies Book Award from the section on Asia and Asian America of the American Sociological Association. And this year, in 2020, he is publishing two new books. One of them is titled City on the Edge, Hong Kong Under Chinese Rule, which is coming out very soon. And the other book, which is the topic of his talk today, is titled Clash of Empires from Chimerica to the New Cold War. Ho-fung's talk will be followed by a Q&A session. You can ask your questions directly to him. Alternatively, you can also write your questions and comments on the Q&A box on the Zoom. So Ho-fung, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Barak, for your generous introduction, and I'm very happy to talk about my new book. It's a little book that actually I always tell people that my two books, one is modeled after Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, which is this Clash of Empires book. And actually, I draw a lot on Lenin's discussion of imperialism at the end of the book to make some historical comparison between the US-China rivalry today with the UK and Germany rivalry a century ago. There's some key difference, but also there's some interesting similarity that I hope I can have enough time to get to toward the end. But first of all, let me share my slides. I am going to talk about 40-45 minutes, but I always prepare more slides than I can cover. So hopefully that if there's some questions related to some of the slides that I could not cover in the Q&A, then I'll be happy to get to. So this is the cover of this little book. It is in actually a little book series by Cambridge. It's Global China. There's also quite a number of other exciting titles that you can check it out. And it has a window of free access, but it has ended in early April. During that free window of access, everybody can download it, the whole book. Even though the free access has ended, I bet some of you might be able to still access to it through your university library. If not, that ask Barak or ask me, that I'm happy to share. So basically, this little book is like about just short of 100 pages, is to give a kind of explanation about why US-China, that relation that was very harmonious, very cooperative. The two economy was integrated in the 1990s and 2000s, and suddenly turned into this recent rivalry today. And of course, that the discussion is about to add in Russia, to add in all other things, and there's a lot of talk about the world is being separated into two blocks, and particularly in Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, that countries are feeling the pressure to choose between China or US in recently, for example, in the Solomon Island in the South Pacific. So there's this kind of a US-China competition, and in Latin America as well. So I want to give a structural explanation of why things turn badly, and in journalism and in some kind of public intellectual commentary, that people tend to blame certain personality for this change in relation. Donald Trump on the US side and Xi Jinping on the China side. It seems the two leaders changed the nature of the foreign policy of the country, and then lead to this clash and then end the harmony. But it appealed to the mass readers, and it seemed to be easy to understand. But when you dig deep and if you follow long enough, you know that it is not correct, because what I argue is that actually the deterioration of US-China relation actually started in the second term of Obama administration. Even though Obama is a polite person, and then he talk about things in a very diplomatic language, so people not paying enough attention won't realize that the relation changed already. But actually, it's very interesting that during Obama administration, that he accelerated the Trans-Pacific Partnership free trade deal. That is a kind of a free trade deal to include all Asia Pacific countries, excluding China, with a kind of intention to isolate China and put pressure on China to change its economic system if it want to join. So it is the first thing that Obama did to put pressure on China, and of course also the freedom of navigation operation in South China Sea, and a pivot to Asia policy under Obama administration. And when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, that they start to relocate a lot of naval forces of the US from the Middle East, from other parts of the world to South China Sea to counteract China's aggressiveness in its claim of sovereignty in South China Sea against the overlapping sovereignty claim of many other countries like Philippines and Malaysia that are US allies or friends. So this started in the Obama administration, and interesting enough that in the first few months of Trump administration, and even during the election, you see these Chinese official scholars and official media is talking about actually Donald Trump is better than Hillary Clinton to be the president, because Hillary Clinton will continue the Obama policy of containing China, and Donald Trump is a businessman who can strike deal. And so it's the expectation in the election in 2016. And even after Trump got elected, became president in the first few months, Donald Trump actually stopped for a few months the freedom of navigation operation in South China Sea. So much so that bipartisan Congress members, senators, and House of Representative members from both the Democratic and Republican Party write a joint letter to Donald Trump, worrying that Trump is trying to appease China, to make a deal about other things. So they're so worried that they write a joint letter to put pressure on Trump to make sure that Trump will continue the kind of a tough policy on China. So it actually that Trump didn't start. Of course, later he started the trade war, and then Biden continued. And actually, I will go into the details later, that the trade war was not just kind of a whim of some crazy idea in Trump had. That actually that when Trump just got elected, actually the US manufacturing associations and many chamber of commerce are writing report, publishing documents, and to put pressure on the new administration to get tough on China on trade issues. Actually, that it is the industries and that a significant portion of the segments are asking for trade war. Actually, it is very interesting, and the same is the Xi Jinping. That many people now say that Xi Jinping was a statist guy, and he ended the market reform and make the Chinese market more closed. But actually, if you follow long enough, you know that the statist turn of Chinese political economy started in Xi Jinping predecessor, which is Hu Jintao era, and when Xi Jinping started his term in 2013, 2014, there's a lot of official media talking about Xi Jinping is going to do what they call at the time the surprise side structural reform. That is to put to kind of a big push to a new round of market reform. So much so that in 2014 or 15, that New York Times has an article saying that Xi Jinping is the new Reagan of China. So actually it is very interesting that early on people expect Xi Jinping to be more market oriented. In the end, he became more and more statist that continue and redouble the trend that started with his predecessor. So we see this kind of structural trend already started before Trump and before Xi Jinping, but it just continued and accelerated. So what we need to ask beyond the headlines, beyond journalistic account is that what is the structural explanation or larger contextual explanation of why the two countries, what are the larger forces that push the two countries into more antagonistic mode of relation. So I'm going to skip the first few lines about the theory of foreign policy. And of course that I only pick on one, that the Thucydides traps is the most popular. It is by a Harvard professor. It became a household theory to explain US-China rivalry. It just explain in a very simple term that the US is an established power and China is the rising power. So in history, according to this theory, every rising power want to challenge the established power, and then it led to war like UK and Germany and many other examples in history. But actually, the more you look into it, the more you think that there might be some truism in it, but definitely is not the whole story, because in history, not every single rising power became antagonistic with the established power. One example is like the US and UK, that in the early 20th century, US is also a rising power, but in the end, it became a very important allies of the old established power, UK and France, not like Germany, which challenged UK and France as an established power, as a rising power. So, and it's some other case like Japan. In the early 20th century, it switched side. In the First World War, Japan was fighting on the side of UK and the Allies, but in the Second World War, so in the First World War, Japan is with the established power, but in the Second World War, definitely we all know that Japan was on the side of the Axis, Germany and Italy, and on the side of the rising power to challenge the established power. So it is not inevitable that a rising power will be antagonistic with established power, and there are many other different cases in which a rising power were very solid allies with established power, or sometimes they shift side. So we see that it is not the satisfactory and sufficient explanation of things. So we need to find more sophisticated explanation. So with theoretical review is here, that I have more in the slide, but that in the interest of time, I can't go off it everything. So to explain why US-China relation deteriorate, we first need to look at how the so-called Chimerica, of course, is very famous kind of phrase coined by the historian economist Leo Ferguson. He said that China and America, that he published an article in 2007 saying that US and China economy was so integrated that economically it looked like one country, one integrated country. He called Chimerica, and he called China as the Western Chimerica, and America is the Eastern Chimerica, just the East Coast and West Coast of the US. So it's how integrated it is. So it is this kind of economic integration. At the height of the integration is, of course, after China got into WTO and in the late in the 2000s. First, we need to explain how it happened. It's not like we shouldn't take it for granted because after the end of Cold War, actually in the 1990s, geopolitically, China and US is already on a coalition course. And you look at the data of the South China Sea conflict, actually that the 1970s, 1980s, relatively peaceful, but 1990s already, you see China has been clashing with many of the countries in the region. Some of them are US allies with, for example, Philippines has US bases there. They have a security treaty, and Malaysia and Indonesia as well. And of course, Japan and South Korea. And so all these kind of territory disputes start to spike in the 1990s. And US, you look at the discourse of the geopolitical elite, the foreign policy elite, they start to talk about the China threat. And they just start to worry about it in the Pentagon, in the State Department. And if you read Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilization 1996 and the article 1994, he's not only talking about the Islamic world as a challenge to Western power, he's talking about alliance between Islamic world and China to challenge US jointly. So he already see that Islamic world, terrorism, and also a more assertive China is going to be the major geopolitical challenge to US domination in the world. So in the 1990s, that people already see this kind of a geopolitical tension. And of course, that if people still remember, in the 1996, there was Taiwan Strait crisis, that the Clinton administration sent a carrier group to sail through the Taiwan Strait, and the tension is very high. And 1999, there was a bombing, U.S. bombing of Chinese embassy in Belgrade in the war over Kosovo. It's still not clear whether it's a deliberate bombing or accidental bombing, as Clinton apologized. But tension was very, very high. And definitely the 2001, right before 9/11, in the first year of the George W. Bush administration, was a South China Sea spy plane incident, that American reconnaissance plane to clash with China's fighter jet, and the China fighter jet crashed into the sea, and the pilot died, and then the U.S. biplane was escorted by other China fighter jet to land in the Hainan Island in China, and the crew member of the U.S. biplane was like held hostage for quite a while, and negotiation was going on between the Bush administration and China. So the tension, geopolitical tension, already very high in the 1990s, and in the early 1990s, when Clinton first came into office in the White House in 1993, and actually it's very interesting. At that time, Clinton is running on a platform of tying free trade with China with the issue of human rights. It was endorsed by the trade union, labor union, and human rights activists, because it was right after the end of communism in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, and the democratization of the beginning of the democratization of South Africa and many other places. So there was optimism and all this kind of assumption. And China just underwent this kind of a 1989 crackdown of Tiananmen democratic movement. The blood is still fresh. So in 1993, when Clinton came in office, and he really wanted to tie the China trade issue with human rights issue, and in 1993, he issued a policy that China goods free trade, low tariff access to U.S. market will be reviewed annually and conditional upon the human right improvement. If there's low human right improvement in major areas, and then the tariff against Chinese goods will be raised significantly. So it's actually very interesting. It's a 1993 policy. And at that time, in 1992, 1993, China was very vulnerable economically, because after the Tiananmen crackdown in 1989, there was economic stagnation. In 1992, there was Deng Xiaoping Southern tour to rejuvenate the market reform, and then the market reform started again, but there was immediately the overheating, hyperinflation, going up to like nearly 25% inflation rate in 1992, 93, 94. And actually the foreign exchange reserve in 91, 92, 93 is starting to deplete. And so bad that, and remember at that time the Soviet Union just collapsed. So 92, 93, that the CCP in Beijing is really in a crisis mode. They really worry about the economic overheating, the balance of payment crisis, that people find it difficult to associate the word or phrase balance of payment crisis with China nowadays. But back in the 92, 93, China was in the balance of payment crisis. So it is so bad that that in 1993 and 94, that China shifts gear and then did a very radical policy shift to export-oriented growth. So I don't have time to go into detail. It is in my previous book, The China Boom. It's very interesting that Zhu Rongji, the vice premier at that time, took charge of economic policy. And he's telling people in a kind of at that time, it was a secret speech in National Cathedral meeting later, but the speech was published after he retired. So we know what he talked about. What he talked about is that we have too much emphasis on the agriculture and rural industries before. It held up surplus labor. It is hurting export industries, export processing industries. So let us sacrifice some of the agriculture and sacrifice rural industries and to let the surplus labor get out of the country, deep countryside and go to work in the coastal factories, and then let us boost our export. It was after this that this kind of China internal migration from the deep rural province to the coastal export factories started. And when China, and also 1994, that 1993, that China, 1994 January 1st, China massively devalued the currencies to boost export. So it is the huge shift of policy. So it you see how desperate they are at the time. But actually at that particular moment, that China was very much looking forward to become a kind of export-oriented powerhouse, because before 1993, China market reform was based on domestic market mostly. That's some export going on, but the export as share of GDP is never as high as other Asian tigers of the time. But 1993 is a big turning point. But it is unfortunate that at that same time when China lead export modes, Clinton came in and established this kind of a tying China goods low tariff access to U.S. market to human rights conditions policy in 1993. What is puzzling is that it is very interesting that I can go on forever, but I don't have time. Is that my China Boom was translated into mainland China in a simplified Chinese in a major economic press, Cynic, and state-owned publishing house. And then I don't have the translation right, so they translated and they got the translation right from the publisher and then sent a copy to me after they are done. And so I didn't have a chance to look at the translation before they are published, and only after they are published, I take a look. And then it's very common that they would change some of the content actually to fit their political censorship and thing. And then to my surprise, some of the things that I expect they cut out and didn't change, like the reference to the 1989 the unrest and the South China Sea conflict. But something that is I don't expect them to change, they actually change systematically. One is that whenever I make reference to capitalism in China, they change the word capitalism to market socialism with Chinese characteristics. So it is not all right to talk about this capitalism in China. That I have a separate article published in Socio-Economic Review. It is a short article in a symposium to reflect on what this means. But it's another topic, but it's actually it's very interesting. But this China shift to export orientation it clashed with the Clinton first year policy of linking so-called MFN status that assure that China can have low tariff access to US market with human rights condition. And then it was endorsed by human rights activists, and also the State Department is full of like human rights idealists at the time, like Winston Lord and Madeleine Albright. They all, the State Department of the first Clinton years are all advocating using the foreign policy goal of the US is to promote human rights and using all kind of foreign policy economic tools to promote human rights and things like that. And the labor union also definitely love this policy because they don't like free trade at all. But what happened is that it's interesting that I look at the People's Daily, the Chinese major official newspaper, and then count. And after 1993, Clinton have this policy. I start to see a spike, a huge spike of trip by U.S. business executive to China, and also Chinese official are touring a lot in the U.S. to visit U.S. corporate headquarters. And then what I look into is that they are giving this U.S. corporation a lot of sweet deals and MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, and all the things of this sort, and explicitly tie it to the request of this corporation to lobby for China in Washington to get rid of the human rights condition of China goods, low tariff access to U.S. market. So you see definitely in between 1993 May, that is when Clinton announced the policy, to 1994 May, actually, that 1994, interestingly, Clinton announced that he dropped the policy of linking human rights with trade with China. So it is a 180-degree reversal. So what happened between the 1993 announcement and the 1994 reversal is that you see this kind of a Beijing is soliciting U.S. corporate efforts to help lobby against this human rights condition of China goods low tariff access to U.S. market. And I look at what corporation that China is targeting to elicit their help, and what kind of deal they offer. Is that it's interesting. There's many of them are lot corporations that do trade at all, or trade with China at all. And some of the later big corporations that end up being the big winner of China trade, like Apple or Walmart, is totally absent. What China target at the time are the politically influential company like AT&T, a telecommunication company, an oil company, ExxonMobil, Amoco, and all that kind of companies. And what China offer to them and tie it to the China request of their help in helping lobbying Washington to get rid of the human rights condition of China trade is, for example, for AT&T, that China signed an MOU with AT&T, making kind of a promise that China telecommunication market will be open. When it opened, that AT&T will play a huge role in running China telecommunication networks and infrastructures. So it is this expectation that AT&T will become dominant in the China telecommunication network and make AT&T a key lobbyist to lobby against the human rights condition of China trade, even though that this company itself has little to do with trade, importing of goods from China and things like that. The oil company as well, that China is offering oil drill right and access to gas field to Inner Mongolia, South China Sea, and various locations in China to this American oil company, energy company, in exchange for this oil company, energy company lobbying for China low tariff access to the U.S. market, disregarding human rights condition. And there's also a lot of other companies like aerospace and many other companies. So it's very interesting that China is targeting politically influential big corporations to offer them non-trade related or non-trade direct, not directly related to trade kind of offer and deal, to mobilize the efforts to lobby Congress and the White House to take away the human rights conditions of China trade. And of course that I did a database to look at this lobbying activity. It is very, very pervasive, and in the end it forced Congress and Clinton to drop the human rights condition on China trade. And the rest is history. That in 1994 China, Clinton and Congress take away the human rights condition. There's some resistance in the Congress. One of the key House of Representative member to fight this reversal, who advocate we should continue to put human rights condition on China trade, is actually the Bernie Sanders, speaking in the name of the American workers' interest. And then after this taking away the human rights condition, because with the human rights condition on China trade, it will create a kind of a roadblock to American corporation dealing with China or investment in China, because you never know when this Chinese goods low tariff access to U.S. market will end, because there's any renewal. If any year that the U.S. government and Congress determine that China human right is very bad, and then less to raise the tariff, then the low tariff access to U.S. market will end. So nobody want to invest in China. Nobody want to do a big imports of Chinese goods in China trade because of this uncertainty. But after this human right thing is taken away in 1994, then the renewal of China's so-called MFN, most favored nation status in trade in the U.S. is becoming nearly automatic. So it's guaranteed that China's good will have continuous low tariff access to U.S. market. And then after this uncertainty is taken out, then the rest is history. That the companies start to invest in China and try to produce stuff in China. Initially reluctantly, but eventually everybody goes there. And Apple is a very interesting example. Apple in the 1990s that focused on expanding their production facilities in California and Colorado because they want to produce every Apple product in the US. And later on, that after China trade opened up, that they moved to China, and now all Apple products sold globally are mostly produced in China, though with foreign components. But Apple was not involved in lobbying for China trade at the beginning. Only after this free trade and no tariff access become reality, they went in, and many companies, including Walmart and their suppliers, are like that. So they were not interested in lobbying for free trade with China, because in the 1990s, the vision of globalization is not about China. It's about NAFTA, Mexico, South America. So the discussion at the time is that actually the frontier of globalization and manufacturing outsourcing for US companies is to South America, expanding NAFTA into a huge American free trade zone. And China at that time, that was perceived to be so far away. So, but the Beijing was very taking the initiative to mobilize US corporation effort to lobby for continuous low tariff access to US market, and then adopt a lot of industrial policy to attract and the preference policy, and a lot of policy to attract US corporation to relocate to China, to move the whole supply chain to China. That the rest is history. And then after this kind of process started, it generated a kind of a group of vested interests to continue lobby for favorable policy to China in the US. And it culminated into US big support of China getting into WTO in 2001. And then the US-China trade continued to balloon, and the rest is history again. So what happened actually is that we see in the 1990s is that geopolitically, the tension is already building up. The foreign policy elite in the US is already seeing China as a challenge and want to contain China geopolitically. But there was a break on this tendency. That is the break from the corporate sector that was initiated and mobilized by Beijing. And then we see in the 1990s, whenever there is all policy discussion about getting tough on China, either on geopolitical issues or human rights issue, that the US corporation always become the kind of a restrainer to lobby against those tendency in the foreign policy elite. So it is so in the 1993, 94, I don't have time to talk in that detail, but it is very interesting to look at in 1993 and 94, there's actually a open debate and power struggle between Wall Street and the State Department. The State Department want to maintain the human rights condition on China trade, and the Wall Street opening against it. And their representative, Robert Rubin, who is already in the Clinton administrations, running the National Economic Council in the Clinton government, is openly having some heated exchange with State Departments and Congress leaders like Nancy Pelosi. So it is this kind of a U.S. corporation led by the Wall Street, represented by Wall Street, becoming the kind of a proxy of Beijing interests, and then to fight with the foreign policy elite who want to prioritize human rights and geopolitical containment of China. So it was the situation of the 1990s. And what happened, of course, and then the Chimerica started in the 2000s. when the corporation of the US continued to lobby for China and the geopolitical elite, foreign policy elite in Washington became occupied in Afghanistan and Iraq and didn't have much time to focus on the Pacific. So the tension, even the geopolitical tension, died down a little bit, so that it was the whole most harmonious relation. So how did went bad and turn to the south side, downside, is that actually it is the interesting cartoon that accompany Leo Ferguson op-ed in New York Times. I believe it is in 2009 or 2010 about Chimerica. So the conception of the time is that China and US is integrated into one big monster co-governing the whole world. So much so that you can portray them as a single monster, not two. So it is the height of the Chimerica, but things turned bad very fast after the global financial crisis and the aftermath, 2008. So it is first is the beginning of the end of the China boom that I don't have time to explain this graph, but it is the kind of a graph that's showing the ups and downs of the Chinese economy better than GDP. And actually it is consistent with the GDP data, but because it is a manufacturing purchasing manager index, I prefer this figure because it has a Chinese official figures and also a private figures used to done by HSBC, but now done by the Chinese magazine. So we can cross-check the two figure to verify it, and they are very consistent. So the line of 50 here is the line of stagnation. Above 50, meaning the Chinese manufacturing is expanding. Below 50, meaning that it is contracting. So you see that it has been expanding robustly before 2008 and the global financial crisis hit. It is a big dip, but also it has a huge successful rebound. We all know that this Chinese rebound after the global financial crisis is driven by debt, driven by fiscal and monetary stimulus, that the state bank opened the floodgate of lending to local government and state enterprises and state-connected private enterprises to build stuff, railroads and steel mill, coal plants, apartment complex, villas and subways system and everything. So this building spree and construction spree financed by debt and led to a kind of rebound. But after the rebound, the Chinese economy actually slowed down and tapered down, hovering around the stagnation line. And here is the COVID and the rebound. And after the rebound, then it went back to this kind of a hovering around the stagnation line. And then this line is kind of the loan creation. You see this kind of when the economy slowed down too much, that the state bank opened the floodgate again to stimulate constructions and investment to push the economy back up again. But each time that it led a bigger and bigger amount of loans to create a smaller and smaller amount of stimulus. So it's just like drug addiction. So I would say China is addicted to debt now. So as we can see in the real estate market crisis is still brewing, but because of the Ukraine thing that nobody pay attention anymore, but it's still getting worse and worse. The bank is involved and then the real estate giants are involved. So so it is fundamentally an overcapacity problem because the initial rebound after the global financial crisis that it created huge employment and economic activities. But after the things are built, some of the things are good, of course, high-speed rail, some lines are good, but not all lines are profitable, and steel mill as well, that there's a glut of the steel in China and the oversupply of coal power generation capacity, and there's a surplus capacity in most major sectors, and that let alone lead us to say the real estate the sectors that they're much more apartment than people can afford and need. So it is a huge surplus capacity problem. So China's economy starts to slow down. So the China start to slow down. The response is to try to find a way to cannibalize, actually, basically, foreign enterprise and private enterprise within the Chinese economy to help the state enterprises. On the one hand, and to find to export the surplus capacity on the other hand. So what we see is that this kind of profit margins fall after 2010. So this technological part I don't have time to deal with, so I might come back. And interestingly, that one key sectors involved is this kind of a construction machine manufacturers in China. There's a three big one. They are the three caterpillar of China. The Xugong is XC, MG, Sany, and Sumlion. So you see that during the stimulus, their revenue growth is very robust. But after the stimulus effect taper off, the economic slowdown started, their revenue growth got into negative. It's very bad until 2014, 2015. It went up again. It seems that they find a solution to the surface capacity problem. And then I go and look at the company report to look at what happened. It's very interesting. In the 2010, 2011, the expansion and growth of their revenue is driven by the construction of the high-speed rail, and steel plant and all this kind of investment is domestic order. But after 2014, 2015, in their company report, they mentioned that all the new orders, all the growth of orders come from Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Sri Lanka, the Middle East, and Latin America. So it's all this kind of Belt and Road country, basically, to order their construction machines that they manufacture, and they are encountering surplus capacity. So basically, is a kind of an export of surplus capacity that that then, and because 2013 is the time when the Belt and Road started, that Xi Jinping start to ask the official government banks to lend money to, or sometimes lend money mostly to developing countries, and some think tank report we find out that the Chinese loans doesn't have policy string attached it, but they have this procurement condition that like CSIS has a report finding out that loans issued by traditional multilateral bank like the World Bank and Asia Development Bank, the government who got the loan, and then they hire local contractors, third country contractors, and other different kind of contractors to bid for the construction contract. But for China loan funded project, they are nearly 90% only hire Chinese construction company to do the job, or use Chinese material. So obviously there's a kind of a procurement and contracting condition for this loan. And so it is how China government actually help this state company, joint company plagued by overcapacity. That is, they give loan to other developing countries' government on the condition that they hire Chinese company and use Chinese products to do the jobs. So it is a kind of export of surplus capacity. And domestically, that after 2010, China start to have a lot of policy, like the anti-monopoly law, allegedly that they target foreign companies in China rather than China state-owned company, which is as monopolistic, and also cybersecurity law enacted about around the same time, that they are using this cybersecurity law to allegedly ask foreign company in China to give away trade secret and even password of their servers and customer data and source code and all kind of information that is deemed precious to the foreign company. So it start to have this kind of a foreign companies feeling the heat in China, and then so what happened is that this U.S. corporation, there's a lot of cases that I don't have time to talk about it in details, but AT&T is a very interesting example. It's an early example because, as I said before, that AT&T was a key lobbyist to take away the human rights condition for China trade on behalf of Beijing, with the expectation that the China telecommunication market will be wide open to them. But after that goal is achieved, China government changed policy, and then the established law to forbade foreign company to have major involvement in China telecommunication network. And then Chinese government start to cultivate their own state-owned champion telecommunication company to monopolize the whole telecommunication network. So basically AT&T, you can't see many of them or any of its presence in China nowadays because it was squeezed out after it is used. to put it bluntly, that after they did the job for China in 93, 94 to take away the human rights condition of China trade, and then the Chinese telecommunication market is not up for grab for them. But now it is totally dominated and monopolized. It's solely by this Chinese state-owned giant, China Telecom, China Mobile. You don't see foreign companies playing any significant part in the China telecommunication market. So it is an early example, but it happened more and more. I don't have time. Again, it's a Caterpillar. It's the construction machine company that also involved in lobbying for China to take for China to ask US to take away the human rights condition on trade, and then Caterpillar got in the China market, have joint venture to make and then sell construction machines in the China market, make a lot of profit, and then later on, very soon, we start to see report that some of these former partners of Caterpillar, China's state-owned company, they start to make construction machine that look very, very alike, very, very similar to the Caterpillar machine, but like sold half the price of it, and then Caterpillar start to feel like not doing so good and squeeze out and feel the pressure in the Chinese market. It lost the market share in China market and later lost market share in developing countries market. So what you see is that these companies, one after the other, that they had a good time in China with the expectation of opening up, and after 2010, it started to accelerate that they get squeezed in the China market. And then later on, they were squeezed in all these Belt and Road country and developing well as well. So they are having trouble competing with Chinese company now. So what happened is that their corporation no longer keenly lobby for China interest in Washington. Most of them become less enthusiastic in lobbying for China, but in some way, example that even start to become keen lobbyists for anti-China policy. That is very interesting development. So what we see is that there's a lot of sign of it, like 2011 when Obama met with President Hu in White House, and it's the first time Obama talked about this concern that U.S. companies are having a tough time and treated unfairly in Chinese market, and after long lobbying by the U.S. company, then Obama started to make the complaint openly. And there's a lot of U.S. Chamber of Commerce reports showing that U.S. companies in China is feeling the pressure, feeling unwelcome, they are frustrated. There's ups and downs, but the trend is very, very clear from 2010 on, is that they feel squeezed in the Chinese market, and later even in the third country market, mostly in developing countries. And it is interesting that U.S. Chamber of Commerce and American Chamber of Commerce China, they published a report in 2017 to put pressure on the Trump administration, the new Trump administration, to get tough on China on trade, because the U.S. companies are facing a lot of issues and disadvantage in the market in China and in third country market. So you see this kind of a companies shift in this position when this intercapitalist competition between Chinese company and U.S. company intensified. So and there's a lot of data that show it's like U.S. corporate lawsuit against Chinese entities. It spiked after 2010. And then the Fortune 500 company in the top 10, top 30, the exposure to China, according to my measure, also taper off and even decline after 2010. And U.S. companies lobbying in Congress, asking Congress to take action against China over intellectual property issues and market access issues, also rise and peak in around 2010 and stay up, and then later on so rise again. So you all this side, you see this kind of a corporate disposition towards China change radically after 2010 compared to early on. So actually I can get to conclusion now is that so I can skip all this in the Belt and Road countries. And, but what we see is that the explaining shift in US-China policy is that the foreign policy elite who care about the dominance of US in terms of geopolitics, that they see China as rival in the 1990s and 2000s. They see China as partner, but In the 2010s, when China became geopolitically more aggressive, that the foreign policy elite, of course, when the war on terror is winding down, they start to see China as a main rival again. And at the same time, it's not like in the 1990s, the corporation in the US is no longer serving as a restrainer of these antagonistic tendency among the foreign policy elite. But they are in line with this antagonistic tendency in the foreign policy elite to act tough on China. So in 2010s and onward, you see this kind of radical shift in the U.S. Disposition towards China. And while in 1990s and 2000s, whenever there's a Congress member float a bill to accuse China of XYZ and to take action to get tough on China, what happened is that the corporation will mobilize to lobby against the bill. And many times this kind of bill cannot even survive to the point of being voted. When they are voted, they are usually voted down because of the intensive lobbying effort. But right now in the ecology in US Congress is the opposite. Whenever everybody get a bill to accuse China of XYZ, like the recent bill to to ban all goods produced in Xinjiang with concern of the Uyghur forced labor, and that it can be voted favorably and sometimes even unanimously in Congress very fast. And it is the only issue that can unite the Republican and the Democrat nowadays, and many other issues that they vote along party line. But when it comes to China, getting tough on China, that it can be voted unanimously or overwhelmingly passed in Congress. So it is a totally different world now, because the corporate lobbying to try to restrain this antagonistic tendency in the foreign policy elite no longer there. Sometimes some corporation even joining hands to fuel this kind of tendency as well. So it is the explanation that fundamentally we see this kind of U.S.-China relation deteriorating rapidly after 2010 has something to do with the intensifying inter-capitalist competition between the two countries, the cooperation from the two countries after 2010s in the context of the China's economic slowdown and the aggressive statist turn of the Chinese economy after 2010 in the aftermath of the Asian global financial crisis. So it is the conclusion of the explanation. But I would like to spend 2 more minutes to look at the historical parallel. Actually, it is very interesting is that in the 2010s, Hobson and Lenin used a lot from Hobson to explain the UK-German rivalry in terms of the urge of the two countries to export capital to third country, and their clash of economic interest and inter-capitalist rivalry that turned into geopolitical rivalry and lead to world war between UK and Germany primarily, but it's of course also involved Russia and France. What is interesting is that at that time, one thing that show this dynamics is what I call the Belt and Road of Germany in the early 20th century. That is the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad that Wilhelm II devised, but actually served the interests of German steelmaker, German train companies and German banks, because at that time, Germany, like China today, that they have a surplus capacity problem. They have surplus of steel and industrial capacity of all kinds. So the German banks are lining up to lend money to Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire to build this railroad using German steel, German train car to connect Berlin all the way to Baghdad. So is economically, and then it outcompete British bank and French bank in funding this infrastructure constructions of Austro-Hungarian Empire and Ottoman Empire, and geopolitically that this railroad is cut into the spheres of influence of France, UK, and Russia at a time when the world economy is transitioning to oil and Middle East become more and more important. And then this actually that you look at the map of of this railroad, you know why Serbia is the kind of a power cack of the time, because it is kind of a region that Russia support to want to break away and undercut this kind of a German intention to to build a unified space connecting Berlin to Baghdad. So this kind of a thing is very similar to the Belt and Road today, that is driven economically by this urge to export surplus capital, with this, of course, the geopolitical ambition of Wilhelm II at the time to expand the spheres of influence of Germany with its allies and Austro-Hungarian Empire and Ottoman Empire, and then in the end it clashed with established powers, spheres of influence, and in the end it escalated into World War. So it is very similar to today's U.S.-China rivalry, the dynamics, the driving force behind it, and the geography of it. But so it is a similarity. But there's a lot of dissimilarity. But probably we can get to that in the Q&A. Then I'm not too much a dark pessimist to say that the war is inevitable. The situation of the antagonism between U.S. and China today, I would have reason to believe that it is a bit better, and we have reason to be more optimistic than the UK-Germany rivalry 100 years ago. But let's get to it in the Q&A, and if you are interested in that part. But it is but the prediction part of my book. But the main part is the explanation part about why U.S.-China relation got so badly, even though it started very harmoniously like 20, 30 years ago. So here is what I want to share for now. Then I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
So Ho-fung, thanks so much for this fascinating talk. And now we are turning on your microphones of all participants, so you can ask your questions directly to Professor Hung. And I see, yeah, Mina Kozluca has a question. Please, Mina, go ahead. Yeah, microphones are turned on, right?
Yes. It should be, yes. Okay,
yeah.
Sorry. Thank you so much for this talk. It was fascinating. I have several questions. Feel free to answer and not answer some of them. I was curious, I mean, you kind of teased that towards the end of the speech, but I'd be curious to hear more about, you spoke in terms of the sort of anti-imperialist rivalry and drawing parallels with that, but I would be curious to see how you view the role of the nation state in general and like the China-US rivalry in particular in terms of the debates around sort of like contemporary imperialism, because there are some people who are talking about it more in terms of the multinational firms, etc.
Yeah.
I also have, I was also curious about what do you think, this might be a bit of a speculative answer or I don't know, but what do you think are the grassroots winners and losers of the changing dynamics between the two countries in terms of like recipient, you know, in the global south, etc. And also, this is my third question is, what do you think this says, like this trajectory says about the state-capital relations in the respective two countries? And thank you so much.
Great. Let me answer first and before, great. Yeah, that is it's great questions. And give me a chance to elaborate of some of the theme that I don't have a chance to talk about. First, the grassroots loser of all this, and it's very interesting because I'm a big fan of Hobson and Lanning, and then the explanation of this kind of intercapitalist competition actually originate from this the all major capitalist power lead to deal with their falling profits and profitability crisis by, and also overcapacity and overaccumulation by exporting capital to faraway places, to third countries. And then the dynamic is that after they export the capital to the faraway place, they need to protect the investment, and then they will lead to their projection of geopolitical power. And then when all major powers or two major powers are doing it, so their projection of power will clash in the end with one another. So both Hobson and Lanning did say that actually this kind of export of capital is not a kind of inevitable path of dealing with this overaccumulation, that the long expansionist path of dealing with overaccumulation is through internal redistribution. Actually, that Hobson really talk about that if the English working class at the time, and the German working class as well, and get a bigger shares of the surplus and the income and the wealth generated by the industrial development, then there will be a huge domestic consumption power, and then the surplus capacity will not be that big. And just like in China today, that it is not that the real estate is producing absolutely more apartment than people need. Actually, there are also people who want to have a home, who want to live, but they're just not affordable. So there's actually some progressive left leaning advocates about to solve the overcapacity, because it's not only overcapacity that create a big trouble for the real estate developer, but it create overcapacity problem of steel maker and everybody down the supply chain that created this kind of a construction business of real estate. So if you turn all this surplus apartment into social housing, then using government resources to create social housing for the people, then this surplus capacity can be dealt with. Then this is how many actually the capitalist countries deal with this overcapacity problem, by what Manuel Castells talked about, collective consumption and social housing, and in many social democracy in the 1950s and 60s. So it is a really possible path. You don't need to intensify intercapitalist competition and in a world scale to solve this overcapacity problem through redistribution. The question is that the political institutions, both in the US and China and in major capitalist power, is tilted against the grassroots and the lower classes. So there's less incentive to solve this problem through redistribution than by exporting capital to turn the company into transnational company to invest in overseas market. So it is the situation. So in the end, that the grassroots in all big powers involved is not only loser because of the conflicts that this kind of dynamic can create, but also they already are losing in the first hand when this capitalist power are using this export of capital instead of redistribution to solve this problem. So it is my response to that one. And the other one is about nation and empires and imperialism. It's interesting that, again, that following Hobson and Manning, that the classical definition of this imperialism is not only colonialism. So many people still cite Lenin's work on imperialism without actually remembering what he's talking about. He's not talking about formal colony. He's talking about export of capital and the projection of geopolitical influence and power after the following the export of capital as a kind of a form of imperialism. So it include all forms of imperialism, and formal colonization is only one form. And then Lenin is talking about, for example, German lending to Argentina and Brazil to build railway, and then they try to extend the diplomatic influence over in Brazil and Argentina that create diplomatic tension with the UK. So it is also a kind of inter-imperial rivalry, not only about colonies. So that what we see is this kind of export of capital is the driving force. So in this sense, US and all these core countries, of course, is empire, but in the kind of social science or critical social science, it is still people are stuck in this the old analogy and old framework, and can't imagine China as an empire. But in the sense that China is aggressively exporting capital and projecting geopolitical influence, creating its own spheres of influence to protect their investments. And in that sense, China is an empire, even though China didn't have formal colonies or didn't have much, and depending on how you count Xinjiang and Tibet and all those places. But China is, and even China official scholar, it's interesting to note that they already starting to talk about empire imperialism in a positive sense. They did say that China should learn from the arts and techniques of empire from UK, from the US, and so on and so forth. And there's one official scholar which is very influential in policy making, and he is a law professor in the Peking University, and many of his work is translated into English because people do know his influence He's one of the scholars who introduced Carl Schmitt, that is the last legal theorist into China. But he already wrote about that China need to build a world empire 2.0 and learning from the art and techniques of empire from the old empire, so that even Chinese elite is already consciously seeing itself as an empire. So in this sense, that we don't need to shy away from characterizing China as an imperial power now, in a kind of a Lenin and Hobson sense, and also even in the sense of their self the ambition or the consciousness.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mina. Yeah, other questions? Like Mina, I have a couple of questions actually. So the last point actually you said, on the one hand, China is, head-on competing with the United States, probably one of the, or the chief, competitor of the US capital and state. On the other hand, as you are, of course, very familiar with, world systems, literature, the whole, core semi-periphery sort of, tripartite division of world economy. And you also, of course, discuss that literature to some extent here as well, in your book as well. So inspired from that, so, you compare, of course, Germany versus UK in the first half of the 20th century and sort of China versus USA now. And this reminds me like from one angle, China, again, like a, GDP per capita of $10,000 and technologically, although making great leap forwards, but still very backward, let's say, compared with the West and Japan. So on the one hand, it looks like, semi-peripheral country, but of course it's not an average semi-peripheral country. It's the second largest, economy. So after US. So, so I'm wondering about, both whether this semi-peripheral character, if you look at it from one angle, does it give a sort of unique character to, China-US competition compared to, let's say, Germany-UK competition?
Yes.
And like, it will be, of course, it will be like, let's say one manifestation will be, let's say, Chinese government's, let's say, capacity to invest in its military. The other maybe think about it is the thing that you just, you talked in your talk, a lot of the competition is actually within China, right? Within the Chinese market. You also, of course, added that China and US are competing, companies are competing in the developing countries market, but to what extent it is, a China market problem or like a really globally cutthroat economic competition between the two, which is, of course, which has implications for, again, Chinese competitiveness, technological power. So that is the angle that I'll be very happy to hear more from you. The other question is, of course, BRI is extremely important, and you also discussed it in the book and in your talk. And it's, again, one way to, let's say, solve actually overcapacity problem. But at the same time, you're also familiar with a lot of the, of course, Chinese failed projects and so on and so forth in the BRI region. So to what extent this BRI project is really bringing returns? Because attempting to solve the overcapacity problem through BRI is one thing, but solving it actually is another. And so to what extent?
Yeah.
And one maybe final question will be like, the wings, different. So of course we have Xi Jinping, very strong hold on power, and in China. But to what extent do you observe certain differences of opinion, divisions within this CCP-PRC establishment with regard to US-China competition, between more aggressive and less aggressive factions or something? Thank you.
Great. They're all great questions that give me a chance to show some of the point that I don't have time to cover. That is that the one key thing, of course, is that China is a semi-periphery giant, and actually, according to some, it is some region already moved to high income, but it's very uneven, as you know. That in comparison to early 20th century Germany, so it is a key difference. That actually is why I have reason to be relatively optimistic about the pathway of U.S.-China rivalry will not be heading toward the kind of world war like Germany and UK end up in the early 20th century. That Germany started as a semi-periphery in the 19th century, but in the late 19th or early 20th century is already a core country, not only in terms of this kind of a per capita GDP measure, but also in the kind of a technological ladder and supply chain or commodity chain network. And then here I want to share my screen again to go over the slides about the technological part of the equation. That let's see that how to get back to earlier. Oh no. Okay, sorry. Let me try to do it again. Here that is because Germany in the by the early 20th century is already a technological cutting edge country, that they have this most of the sector that can rely on itself to create the most advanced products, but it is not the case for China now. So when the US is talking about decoupling from China, that actually Germany at that time can afford decouple from the UK, didn't rely on UK supply to build all these weapons and advanced chemicals, petrochemicals, and sophisticated machinery and weapon and products, and so they can have more incentive and less restraint to have a war with UK. But in China nowadays, you see that, for example, by sheer patent count, China is the biggest countries and having the most number of patent registered. So many people say that China is already a technological giant, but it is kind of a smoke screen. It is not true, because you look at there's a Bloomberg report and counting this patent. Because if you register for a patent, and you need to pay a license fees, the patent fees to keep the patent, to renew it every year. But they find that after 5 years, 91% of the Chinese patents given up, meaning that they are commercially not viable. So what happened is that if you're familiar with the Chinese system, is that a lot of lab and companies, the local government and university, they get the research grant, huge research grant, from the scientific authorities and industrial authorities from the Chinese government to develop some new products or some new technology, and then they registered the patent as the end result. But the thing is that they get the money and then they develop this kind of thing, and they don't care whether it is useful or not industrially. So that's all this kind of you get the grant and get this useless patent. You get the money anyway. You don't care about whether it is useful, and so it is explaining the phenomenon why after 5 years most of the patent registered in China is given up. Nobody either bother to pay the patent fee to maintain the patent, and it also reflected in this balance of intellectual property balance of payment. This is an interesting figure that available from World Bank. Because when your country is producing a product, maybe high-tech product, if you use a lot of this technology, the patent of which is owned by a foreign country, you need to pay a patent fee to the country who own the patent that you use for manufacturing that high-tech product, and vice versa. And if other countries need to produce products and manufacture a product that use patent that is registered in your country, that they need to pay the patent holder in your country to manufacture next stuff, and you subtract the two figure, you have a intellectual property balance of payment. So even though China is a huge trade surplus country, and the products exported from China is more and more sophisticated, but you see this China is running a larger and larger intellectual property deficit, meaning that when China climb up the value chain and technological for sophistication in this export, China is relying more and more on foreign technology, because that maybe the iPhone is a good example that is made in China, export from China, but most of the patent that account for iPhone belong to Apple, that is registered in the US. So when the Chinese companies and manufactured and Apple products in China and export to the US, it need to pay patent to the patent holder, mostly Apple. So when China trade surplus is increasing, China intellectual property deficit is also increasing, meaning that China production machine is relying on foreign technology a lot. And of course, that the most well-known example is the high-end computer chips. And then China can manufacture some of the low-end computer chips that can be used in electric fans or some electrical appliances. But for computer, even home computer, laptop computer, then China still lead computer chips made by US or US allies using US technology. So in this sense, China is much less technologically self-sustainable. And US is still a huge technologically and intellectual property surplus country. And Russia is the same. So it's why that in that and many elites within China already kind of warn or hint that it will China really lead to develop this capacity to make high-end computer chip itself, but they have been talking about it for 10-20 years, and there's a lot of money flow into it, but it didn't work out. Many of the kind of a project that claim that they already managed to make a high-end computer chip, they turn out to be scam. It's very difficult to do, and then many people are warning that China is very vulnerable if there's a war with the US, because if US already happening for Huawei, that they ban the chips, the high-end chips to export to China, and ban US allies to export the chips to China, that China fighter plane and rockets and missile will run out of chips, and they don't have the parts to maintain this weapon, because they use a lot of chips that actually rely on this foreign technology. So it is a national security issue, and it's very difficult to do. And it is why that China is cautious militarily, because it's not like Germany in the early 20th century, that Germany already has all the technology it need to maintain and manufacture its own weapon and its most sophisticated product. But China nowadays, even it has the capacity to make all these most sophisticated weapons and products, civilian products, but the technology and the most technologically advanced components of these products still rely on the US. So it is the semi-periphery situation of China that how it factor into the situation, that is how it is different from Germany. But that China can solve it in the end, that like the trajectory of Japan and South Korea is used to be a intellectual property deficit country that become the surplus country. But it is the irony that I will call it an irony of weakness for Japan, and a paradox of weakness for South Korea and Japan, but a paradox of strength for the case of China. Because when you look at the history of the Four Tigers trade dispute with the US, that initially South Korea and Japan didn't have intellectual property protection regimes. So they actually allegedly quote unquote steal technology from US companies to make those products. And then the US company get mad and then raise trade war with them and force them to improve. And then because they are kind of client state of US in terms of geopolitics, so they have to yield. The result of that yielding is that they actually yield to US corporation pressure to develop an intellectual property regime to protect intellectual property. Initially to protect the intellectual property of US company, but in the end, local innovator in Japan and South Korea also benefit, because after this regime is in place, and then people have more incentive to innovate rather than copy. And then very soon that Japan and South Korea become a kind of independent, innovative power. The problem of China is that China is so strong geopolitically to withstand the pressure from the US to protect intellectual property right of the US company. So China development of intellectual property right regimes is delayed. And so it is in the detriment of US company interest, but also in the detriment of the interest of China to develop its own indigenous innovative system. So it is China is going to take a long time. And before that China is still technologically very dependent. So it is the periphery situation of China is different from the German or the situation in the early 20th century. There's one key difference. The other key difference is geopolitical, and of course that China lend a lot of money to foreign countries, and there's a lot of talk about this debt trap and things like that. But you already see that China capacity to project geopolitical power overseas is still very weak. For example, in Sri Lanka, we already see that, or even Venezuela, that they refuse to pay China loans. They're in debt to China, and then they cannot pay. They try to default on China loan, and China cannot do anything about it. Or when a new government came in and tried to renegotiate everything with China, like in Malaysia, that China still not yet able to do anything about it. And if it happened to the U.S. at the height of the Cold War, that the Western powers managed to like if the new government tried to nationalize the Chinese investment or cancel that with China, and then they really have the capacity to manage to create a coup or influence the election, so much so that only the government, to make sure that the government will stick with the terms and to protect U.S. interests. But China didn't have that capacity yet. So it is another key difference between China and early 20th century Germany. And you know that the early 20th Germany, from the 19th century on, it is a very militaristic country, that it unified the country and keep expanding. So you keep fighting war. All the way to the First World War with France and with other places. So it has a well-oiled and well-exercised military muscle. But China is much less militaristic comparatively. That the last major war that China fought with a major country in the kind of with large mobilization, if you don't count the skirmishes with Indian forces in the borderland, but it's a large-scale, real serious battle. That China fought last time is 1979 with Vietnam. So after that, China never had a major military mobilization against a foreign country for 40, 50 years, and all other conflict are skirmishes. And then after 1979, the war with Vietnam, the next major military mobilization is to repress its own people in 1989 after Tiananmen. So China is not that militaristic. So we talk about a lot of this, like China starting to have overseas military base, like in Djibouti and all these kind of places. But actually, China, the projection of military force overseas is still very immature. So much so that, for example, in Pakistan, we already see that. And in Africa, that many security companies is already saying that like China personnel and China facilities is the prime targets of ransom and kidnapping, ransom-oriented kidnapping by bandits, terrorist groups, and all these kind of criminals and things like that. In Pakistan, we already see a number of these kind of cases. And what China do is they're trying to still not yet able to do anything, not like the US to send a SEAL team and Marines to take care of this kind of thing and protect these people and investment. And what China is doing now is to do subcontracting. Actually, the one interesting anecdote is that Eric Prince, he's notorious in the US, maybe in Turkey, not less people know about him, and he's the former CEO of Backwater. It is the mercenary groups that do a lot of war making in Iraq, that the US Pentagon subcontract a lot of dirty job, not exactly dirty job, but actually more difficult jobs to Backwater in Iraq. So they are notorious. But after the Obama administration, Eric Prince, the CEO of Backwater, got into trouble with some tax problem with the Obama administration. So he became like cannot quite go back to the US. And then he ended up in Hong Kong and running a security company, providing security services for Chinese interests and protecting Chinese companies and Chinese personnel in Belt and Road country. They already have a forward base established in Yunnan, in southwest China, and in Urumqi, in Xinjiang, to provide training and security services to Chinese companies in Belt and Road countries. So, but the background is that he's a U.S. Marine, retired, and then formed a Backwater U.S. mercenary company. Then went to Dubai and then now in Hong Kong, and that his security company is actually a subsidiary of a major state-owned company, CITIC, that actually published the Chinese version of the China Boom. It's a major, the biggest China state-owned conglomerate. This is very ironic that China, it showed that China capacity to project military power, let alone influencing election, for example, is much more immature than other major powers, and so much so that the elite to rely on American former Marines to provide this kind of a mercenary service to protect its interests overseas. So it is another kind of reason for optimism that China talk tough, talk powerful, but in terms of technological independence, in terms of projection capacity to project power overseas, is much less than the US, of course, is much less than Germany in the comparable phase of development in the early 20th century. So the assumption is that if the Chinese leaders are rational, I don't have much hope about the elite division because the people hope for elite division in Russia, in China, but in this kind of even North Korea, but in this kind of an autocratic regime that they rule by fear, that when they are brutal enough, even if there's elite who have other opinion, they would rather choose to leave rather than stay in the country and then change the policy. So it's how it is. We need to assume that Xi Jinping will be as solid in his rule as Mr. Kim in North Korea. That we can't bet on elite discontent. But if he is actually rational, then given China's semi-periphery, I'm thankful that Parag mentioned this semi-periphery status as a kind of concept to characterize China, even though it is a kind of a imperial tendency, but because of this semi-periphery, how to say that, this kind of a trap or this kind of an impasse that it didn't have a capacity yet, as in Germany in the early 20th century. So it won't rationally choose to go onto the path of this kind of a major conflict with great power. And then the thing that they might choose to do, and then it's the silver lining, is that this inter-imperial rivalry, because, and also in the early 20th century, there's lack of this kind of a multilateral organization as arena for competition. But now we have all this kind of a multilateral global governing institution can be an arena of competition. So this kind of inter-imperial rivalry can well happen through competing with the US for influence over this organization. We already see it in the WHO, the World Health Organization, in the recent pandemic, and the UN is another arena and many other arenas. So it is well possible that this inter-imperial rivalry, though I think that it is going to inevitably going to escalate, but it might not be escalating in the lethal way like a war, but with a more kind of a geopolitical competition through the struggle for control of this multilateral global governing institution. This is maybe it's my wishful thinking, but in terms of US-China relation or conflict, that it is a possibility that it won't get to outright war. And then you can also tell from China ambivalent and embarrassing position on the recent war in Ukraine and over Russia and things like that. So geopolitically, that China is relatively cautious and relatively rational, I would say, that if you compare it with Wilhelm II in Imperial Germany. But thank you for the question, indeed.
So thanks so much, Ho-fung. We've reached our time limit for today's talk. Yeah. I would like to thank again to Professor Hung for his fascinating talk and his very clear and actually also detailed answers to our questions. We are going to share this talk through KUASIA's YouTube channel so that more people will watch it. So thanks for everyone participating and have a good day.
Great. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for all the questions. It's very, very, very inspiring and helpful.